So I'm just going to jump right into it. So, when you're looking to hire for sales, the best time is when when you're ready to scale. And what that really means is that you should not be hiring for sales if you're just, right now introducing a product to the market. You really should have already identified, who your market and your buyer personas are. You should be clear on your customer's pain. You should have proven your value proposition and business model. So essentially what I'm saying there is you need to do all of your customer validation work and essentially had some level of success in selling your product before you consider hiring a salesperson. Now, I've heard a lot from startups in the past when I ask them about what their go-to-market plan is, and they just say, well, I'll just hire a sales guy, without kind of going through that process of proving their value proposition and business plan. And that's almost always ends up in kind of a bit of a mess, because if as a founder and as a founding group you haven't been able to prove your business model by having success in selling your product, it's unlikely a sales guy will have success in selling it. So it's really go through your customer validation, get some experience in actually selling your products. Make sure it's repeatable, meaning you've managed to sell at least 3 or 4 customers, and then once you've proven it's repeatable and you're looking to scale, is really the best time then to now start thinking about hiring a sales team. The other kind of times when you might want to consider it is because sometimes founders, like driving the sales process, or you may have some kind of sales and marketing go-to-market based founders. But if you're starting to plan, growth and expansion into new markets, then that might require kind of a scale up in your sales capabilities. Sometimes, some organizations have too many leads to handle. That's usually a problem that most startups would like to have, but I have seen examples where they literally can't handle the number of leads that are coming in. So that's a time to certainly consider hiring somebody. And then the other thing to think about before you bring on a salesperson is, do you have a lead generation strategy or process in place? Or are you expecting the sales guy to do all your lead generation? Or are you already implementing some of the things that Rochelle talked about using marketing and content and other things to drive leads to your organization? So I'm just going to move on here. So the types of sales related roles that typically people are hiring for, and sometimes these can all be independent roles, and oftentimes you might hire a single person that does a number of these roles. But as you become more sophisticated and your team grows, you may start specializing more. So one is really around just lead generation, actually, getting those leads, and that can be done by a salesperson through cold calling. But typically, lead generation is also a marketing role, so that can be done through everything from SEO and a content marketing program, outbound email, etc., AdWords, all that kind of stuff. But it certainly can also be done by the salesperson as well. The thing that's really important is that you're clear on what the objectives are of the specific role you're hiring, and that the person you're hiring is clear. Then the other thing is more lead development, where you might take a lead and then do some qualification before it really becomes a true opportunity. Again, oftentimes this is performed by a sales development rep or a business development rep who might be doing both outbound lead generation and also qualifying inbound leads that might come in through your SEO or whatever before they get handoff to a salesperson. Again, salesperson can do that as well, but as you grow a team, you're going to probably start specializing. And obviously, an SDR, BDR is typically a lower cost role than a professional sales guy who's doing opportunity management. So it does make sense at some point as you start growing the team to separate those roles. And then what I would kind of say is traditional sales, which is really opportunity management, taking the customer through from kind of initial discussion, demo, negotiation, close, etc. So that's more what I'd say is kind of the core sales, capability. The other thing is customer success. So what happens, after a deal is closed? onboarding, et cetera, kind of ensuring that the customer is, using the product and being successful with it. And again, oftentimes that can be a completely separate function and person who does that. But initially, you may be expecting the salesperson to do that as well, and that's fine. But again, just make sure it's clear what the expectations are. And the one thing to understand is that some of these functions will take away from the selling time. So if you're expecting your sales guy to do, cold calling and lead development as well as sales and customer success and onboarding, then his actual time spent actually selling is going to somewhat be reduced. And this is the main reason why people specialize. And also, again, that some of these roles tend to be lower cost roles. I also want to talk just a little bit about a hunter versus farmer model, because the question comes up sometimes. And that essentially means, a salesperson who's focused on really net new business, so signing new logos, versus more of an account management role. So that's working with an existing set of accounts. Typically in startups, they don't separate those functions. But as, again, you get more customers and you build out your team, if you have a handful of very strategic or key accounts, and these might be accounts that you literally can't afford to lose, or accounts that where there's a big opportunity maybe to grow the business, then there is kind of a model where you could have an account manager focus on those specific accounts and just build business plans around how you kind of build expansion into those accounts, make sure that they're successful. Also, again, it's a higher touch model, so you're ensuring less churn, et cetera. So it's something to consider if you do have some very high value, very strategic accounts, to consider having an account manager just focused on those specific accounts, as opposed to doing both net new business and account management. And the reason being is typically when you have somebody doing both, they either are better at one versus the other, and might not do as good a job in one versus the other. So if you separate those roles and have people focused on those, then sometimes you'll see more success. Again, not typical for a early stage startup, but as you grow your business, it's something to consider. And then the other role that you'll be looking for is maybe sales management. The one mistake that I've seen is a lot of startups that I'd say are kind of top heavy, where they hire kind of a sales manager and a VP of sales and a CRO. So you've got 3 levels of sales management, and you have like a sales team of 4 or 5. That doesn't make sense. You want to, I think, keep the management layer lean and thin, and I'd say generally, if the founder who is doing sales may act as the sales manager, at least initially, because again, oftentimes that's just overhead, and multiple layers just kind of reduces communication, et cetera. The one thing about and the other aspect of sales management is as you're hiring, we'll talk a little bit about kind of the types of people you hire, and attributes to look for. But are you looking to hire, when you hire a salesperson, looking for somebody who you think has the capability to step into management? Because you're much better, in my mind, to kind of give headroom for people to grow into more senior roles. So you may start with a senior sales guy and move him into management, rather than bringing in a sales manager above him. So going to the topic of contract versus employees, for startups, contract is definitely a viable model. And by the way, part-time employees can also work, but it's a viable model, and it's a way to test the water. So if you're not really sure, how it's going to work, or if you can afford it, or whether a BDR role is really right for you, that one way to do that is on a contract basis, and it's definitely something worth considering. Some of the problems with contract is it's typically a shorter term solution. First of all, you're making less commitment to the contractor, they're less committed to you, and that's something you need to understand. So, sometimes, you may expect them to ramp up their work effort for whatever reason, and they may be expecting to be ramping it down, because you don't really have a regular employee relationship. You have a little less control. and a little less commitment on both sides of that arrangement. The other thing that people misunderstand, I think, is that they think that hiring a contractor is easy. I've seen this a lot with contract sales and BDR, where people think, well, they can just do all the work for me. I don't, it's going to simplify all the work I have to do. But you really have to do a lot of the same work, like to onboard them, to train them on your solution, to do the kind of script development, the list development, et cetera. A lot of that same effort still takes place. It's maybe a little less management, and like I say, a little less commitment. But don't go into that expecting that they're just going to be able to magically do all that work without your involvement. That still requires a lot of your engagement to make that successful. The one thing I have found is that contract is typically less effective if you have a very complex solution. I know of people, for instance, in the medical devices or something, or a complex sales process where you have a lot of stakeholders. Contract tends to be less effective, mainly because it is more complex. It's longer sales cycles, et cetera, and even contractors are less inclined to want to do that type of work on a contract basis. So if you have a very complex solution or sales process, probably hiring people is more the best way to go. And like I say, one of the drawbacks of contracts is you lose this ability to hire somebody who has the ability to grow into more advanced roles. That can happen every now and then with a contractor. You bring him on full time, but oftentimes you kind of lose that. So on the recruiting side, a couple of things to talk about. One is it's really important to be clear on exactly what role and functions you're looking for. So again, I talked about a lot of those roles, everything from lead generation to customer success. So it's very clear. It's very important that you're clear in your mind, what you expect, this person to do, and then be very explicit in communicating to them what those tasks, processes, and objectives are. I've seen sometimes where people hire a salesperson expecting him to do everything, and yet he's just going to be managing opportunities and closing deals. It's like I say, it's totally fine to have kind of a single person who does all of those functions. You just need to make sure that they're clear and that you're clear that that's what's involved and what some of the drawbacks are. So that's I'd say is kind of the most important thing, is that you really define the role very well. The other thing is to think about is what level are you looking for? So are you looking for somebody who's experienced, or you're looking for more kind of a young, ambitious guy who's just going to kind of, learn on the job and grow with your organization? There's advantages and disadvantages to both. Obviously, an experienced guy might be able to bring some of that, sales process experience to the table. But they're sometimes also more set in their ways, and may not be looking so much to kind of grow within your organization. So definitely, depending on the dynamic of your organization, where you are, the type of role you're hiring for, that's something you need to think about. The other thing is when you think about experience, do you need industry experience or domain experience, or both? And what I mean is, if you have a complex industry, so for instance, an example might be the industrial electronic industry, or some manufacturing industries, which are fairly, there's a lot of complexity, maybe chemicals or plastics. You may want somebody who really understands that industry and most of the aspects of what happens and the pains that go on in that industry, versus somebody who just knows, SaaS software. So if you have a solution that's more horizontal, it's maybe, an accounting, for instance, a piece of accounting software, industry expertise doesn't really add much value. But just somebody who's sold SaaS software in the past might be more valuable. But if it's somebody who's working if you're working in a specific vertical industry, then industry experience might be more important. Now, in some cases, you might want both. Like you're looking, I want a guy who has experience selling SaaS software into the industrial electronics industry. The problem is you've just kind of narrowed the pool of candidates you have. So anyway, that's something just to think about, again, depending on the industry, the target industry you're selling into. The other thing, obviously, as you're recruiting, is to think about what your compensation plan is. If you're looking for a very highly experienced person with industry and domain expertise, you're going to probably have to pay them more. If you're looking for kind of more an entry level salary, then you're probably looking at more of an entry level person. So think a little bit about how those things match. The other thing to think through, no matter what level of experience they have, is how are you going to onboard them and train them? Again, I have seen lots of times where people bring on people with a lot of potential, but just kind of like leave them to try to figure it out themselves. And which sometimes can work, but oftentimes you certainly lose a bunch of time and effort probably by doing that. I think it's really important that you bring them on, that you work with them shoulder to shoulder, that you train them on what are the questions they should be asking your customers, what are the pains, what are the objections they're going to come up against. Allow them to demo while you sit and watch them, etc. So there really should be kind of a like a training process. So before you start hiring, think about how you're going to onboard them and train them. The other thing you can think about is internships. Internships, I say, are probably not the best, for kind of a core sales role. But for things like maybe lead generation, or marketing folks, or for business development reps, which tend to be more junior folks anyway, that's something that you can consider. I've seen kind of some companies be very successful with interns. Others I've seen kind of not so much. So it really depends a lot on the individual you hire, and the level of person you're looking for. So certainly I would consider internships. The one reason why a lot of people think about interns or recent grads is there are a lot of programs out there that will help fund those, such as My Tax and for instance, the youth employment program through IRAP and others. So it is definitely something to consider, if you can obviously get some funding to cover some of those things. So key attributes to look for, in my mind, when you're looking for kind of salespeople, you really need people with an entrepreneurial, growth mindset. So this is typically people with the same mindset as a founder. People who, really have the belief that hard work and persistence will allow them to overcome, barriers and challenges. And if they have that, to me, that's the most important thing that leads to success in sales, is having that kind of a growth mindset. Just meaning that they're going to be persistent, that they're not going to be kind of, shut down by objections, etc. I actually think it's important, especially in a startup, to have people who are, ambitious. Again, I'm probably a little biased because I have two sons in their 20s who are both in sales, but I think, young, ambitious people who want to, go ahead, grow within an organization is the type of person that you want. Curiosity, again, is really important. One of the key things, and I talked about it in my sales one-on-one presentation, is one of the key pieces of a sales process is asking questions and listening. And so curiosity is important. And for instance, if you're interviewing somebody and if they don't have any questions about your company, then I kind of question whether they're the right person. They should be curious and they should be asking questions about you and what's going on with the business and why you're hiring and et cetera. What's your industry? So I just think that that's a really important attribute. The ability to overcome challenges, and a lot of these are things that you can ask in an interview. give me an example of when you've done that. I've mentioned probably to some of the folks on this call, I've worked in organizations that would, in an interview, try to put uh, the candidate on the defensive almost immediately, just to see how well they would kind of overcome that challenge, how they would respond to it and overcome a challenge. The other things I know, one of the companies that we work with in the sales acceleration program, they asked all recruits to send in a 1-minute video of themselves saying why they wanted the job. So that again is a bit of a filter. Only people who are willing to kind of overcome that challenge are going to do that. People who aren't willing to do that are probably not people you want anyway. Um, I think that customer centricity is really important. So there's this kind of stereotype of salespeople out there who don't care about the customer. It's all about closing, that type of thing. To me, first of all, I think that is a stereotype. I don't think that's really a reality. But having a focus on the customer is really important, because ultimately, a successful salesperson is somebody who's solving customer problems, understanding customer problems, and helping your organization solve them. And it's critical that your customers are successful, because you want references, you want case studies, you want to be able to grow your footprint within that customer. So it's really critical that that customer, or sorry, that your candidate is customer focused. Again, ability to think on their feet, is important. So, oftentimes in a sales situation, you'll get unexpected objections, and people need to be able to respond, quickly and thoughtfully. Although actually, a very good answer to an objection that you don't have an answer to is to say, "I'll get back to you." Um, and then, if you're looking at a proven, at an existing, salesperson, an experienced salesperson, what you're looking for is a proven record of success over time. This isn't necessarily overachievement, but what you don't want necessarily is somebody who says, like, "Yeah, I knocked it out of the ballpark in Q3 last year," but that he hasn't kind of hit his numbers in other quarters. You really want more a consistent, proven record of success over time. So talking about managing, a couple of these things I've already talked about. So again, in managing a sales team, really important that you have very clear targets and objectives. So this is both, what are your expectations of their activities, and then what, having specific targets in place. And those targets may not necessarily just be deals and revenues. It could be, if you want them to be, for instance, doing outbound calls, then what are the number of calls? It might be conversion ratios. It might be the sales cycle, or whatever. So there's a number of different targets you can do. One thing that I think should always be an objective of a salesperson is case studies and references. So again, these don't necessarily have to be quota targets, but just these might be objectives you put in place. So having a sales team, a CRM system becomes really important. I think most of the companies that we work with, have CRM systems. I'd say not all of them utilize them, in a disciplined way. So as soon as you start bringing in, salespeople, especially multiple salespeople, having a discipline around your CRM system becomes really critical. That's something that you need to have in place. As a founder, you need to be kind of clear on what is the data that you'd be looking for from a CRM system, and then just putting a discipline in place around that. Again, I've talked about this before. I have a whole separate section about this, is using kind of metrics, as an analytical approach and a management approach. So metrics-based kind of management systems. So you're looking at things like, what conversion ratios and closing ratios, and how long deals are stalled, et cetera. So all of those things are kind of important metrics that allow you to kind of judge how your team is doing. You can compare them over time. You can compare them to each other, et cetera. So having a strong kind of metrics analytical approach is really important to managing a sales team. Hence why you need a CRM system and a discipline, in using it. Really critical in my mind to hold regular forecast and pipeline review calls. Like I even at SAP, in most organizations I've worked in, it's done at least weekly, sometimes more often, but certainly I would say at least on a weekly basis, you should be reviewing, a pipeline, forecast, actual deals. If deals are stalled, why are they stalled? How can you help? And again, this is where I think management, input can help people in moving deals forward or helping deals get unstuck. The other thing that's really important is that founders and leaders get involved and stay involved with both key net new deals or key existing accounts. It's really important, I think, that you support the sales team, and especially if these are large strategic accounts, it makes sense for the founders to be involved. The other thing is, one common objection that salespeople get is kind of an inability to kind of get to power, and oftentimes that there's a saying in sales that power talks to power. So by getting your CEO involved, you can maybe reach out to a senior person in that target account and get a conversation going when the salesperson can't. So founders and senior executives should be involved in key deals, should be willing to support key deals. Even at SAP, we used to have, which had a very sophisticated kind of sales organization. We would assign executive sponsor, to any key strategic deals, and we would expect those executive sponsors to be plugged in and know what's going on with those deals. So again, stay plugged in. The other thing that's really important is to analyze both wins and losses. So oftentimes on both of those, people just move on, but it's really important to understand on a win, why did you win that customer? What was the specific pain that, or the specific part of your solution that won them over? Was there a specific reference that resonated with them? Was it a pricing thing? So to really understand, what are those things that that are winning customers over, because then obviously you can replicate those. Now, not every customer is going to be the same, but understanding those things better will help you. And then the other thing is analyzing losses. Also really important, is it to understand, are there maybe questions you could have asked early on that could have led you to understand that maybe your solution wasn't right for that customer? Did you lose to a specific competitor? And if so, what was that feature you lost on? So again, just really important to analyze those just to help your sales process, understand if there's gaps in your product, understand, really are you targeting the right market and the right people, etc. So to me, that's a critical function that is often missed. People just too often kind of, with both wins and losses, just move on. And then celebrate success. I think it's really critical, especially with new salespeople, that you celebrate success. I mentioned one of my sons just started a new sales job quite recently, and for his very first deal, the company sent a bottle of champagne and had them take a picture of him, and they share it within the whole organization, which is a couple thousand people. So that's just something that they put in place it's kind of a discipline to make sure they celebrate success. So think about doing things like that, and sometimes very small little rewards or recognition can go a long way. So I'll talk now a little bit about kind of comp plans. I'm a big proponent of having some kind of an incentive-based compensation plan. To be honest, I only know of one large enterprise software company that I've ever come across that did not have an incentive-based compensation plan that's been successful. Almost all of them do. So essentially, that is some portion of their compensation based on performance. Now, I actually, like a lot of organizations, do that for literally almost every role within the company. SAP actually did, even our development folks, support folks, everybody, some portion of their of their compensation was based on overall company performance. So it doesn't have to be individual performance, it can be team performance or overall company performance. But it's a way to kind of get the organization understanding that sales is a critical function, and that how the company performs is dependent on them, and how well they do is dependent on how well the company does. In a sales organization, the typically marketing, customer success reps, and sales, or business development reps, they would have a much lower variable amount. So you might pay of their total salary, 10 to 20% in variable or commission based incentive, whereas the rest would be salary. And again, typically that would be based on more of a team or an overall kind of sales goals. So it wouldn't be as much based on individual performance. Might be in some cases, but typically not. And then on the sales and sales management team, is usually quite a bit higher. That can be anywhere from 30% to 60%. I know there are people who, I'm not sure how many people out there this is really true. Some people try to hire salespeople at 100% commission. Personally, I don't really think that's a model plan. But I definitely do believe that you should have a fairly high percentage of their overall compensation based on incentive based on performance. The other thing that I do, that I come across a lot, and a lot of companies do this, although I don't think it's the best model, is just having a straight percentage-based commission. So you might say, hey, I'm just going to pay 20% commission, and that's it. And without actually having a specific quota. And I actually think it's really important to have both quarterly and annual quotas, so that people are clear what the objectives are, what your expectations are. And you can then also set different accelerators and things like that. If they if they achieve quota, then maybe you pay them even a higher rate once they achieve that. So there's greater incentives for them to hit those numbers. So definitely, I would highly recommend that you have quotas as well as kind of a percent-based commission structure. Like I said, consider accelerators for overachievements. There's also certain situations where people pay a lower rate for underachievement. So, like for instance, until they hit 50% of quota, they actually get paid out at a lower percentage, and then from 50 to 100%, they get paid out at a higher percentage. So the overall percentage still, matches at 100% quota, but that's kind of one way to de-risk a sales organization. The other thing that's really important is to think about what is included in the comp plan. And there's a lot of different models out there. There's no kind of hard set rule. But one thing that is quite common is that salespeople are compensated on net new and expand business. And I'm talking more about probably a SaaS or software here, but it could be in almost any business, versus renewals. Oftentimes the renewal is more kind of owned by the customer success team, and you may have kind of a separate team managing renewals. But if you have an existing customer where they're significantly expanding their footprint or net new deals, then you'd bring the sales guy, would be involved with those. So you would actually only give him, his quota would only be based on net new and expand, and his compensation would only be based on that, and renewals is kind of a completely separate piece. And then the other thing is if you have both a services model or a hardware model versus software, are those included? And for instance, one thing at SAP, which was obviously around selling software, we actually would sometimes provide commission for services, but it wouldn't contribute to their quota. So we wanted them to hit their quota selling software. So they would still actually get paid if they sold services, but it wouldn't help them kind of achieve quota. And so again, that's another model. Or sometimes you have a completely separate team who looks after services. And hardware might be the same. You might treat it differently. A lot of it depends on kind of, again, what is kind of the core objective? What is it you want them to focus their effort on? And still, you still want to compensate them for other stuff they sell, but it may not be kind of your core focus. So you may not, attribute that to quota. The other thing is things like maintenance and support. And so again, in more traditional software, so non-SaaS software where you're selling kind of perpetual licenses, there's usually a maintenance, like 20% maintenance, whatever. There might be even a separate support fees. Typically, in my experience, reps are never paid for maintenance or support. So it's automatic, it has to be part of the deal, but it's not part of their quota and it's not part of their commission structure. So I'm just going to wrap up with some additional tips, and then hopefully we can answer any questions that come up. So again, one thing I mentioned, I think it's important that the whole organization kind of supports the sales effort, because it's and kind of vice versa. The sales team should also support the rest of the organization. And a good example of that is, for instance, if there are they might hear from a customer that, hey, we're really missing a feature versus our competition. That needs to get back to the development team or to the product management team. And then on the other hand, there may be whatever, a certain roadmap items or different things, upcoming features that the customer might be interested in, then the development team needs to support the sales team in being able to articulate those to the customer. And again, I think part of that can be done through compensation plans, is just, make sure the whole organization is behind the effort to kind of, grow the business. Another just kind of quick thing is for new hires, and a lot of this depends on sales cycle, but it's typical to ramp up quotas over time. So if, for instance, you hire a new guy and you want him to have a $600,000 quota or something, you're probably not going to give him a $150,000 quota for the first quarter. You might give him no quota at all for the first month, pay him 100% salary, and maybe you pay him, you give him a 50% quota for the next 2 months of the first quarter, and then you put him on full quota. So you want to, ramp those up in a way that models their learning ramp. Now, a little bit of that depends on kind of your sales cycle. So if you have a very fast sales cycle, and also like a fairly quick, if it's a simple solution that people can pick up pretty quickly, then you may not do that. So it's something to consider, and depends a little bit on the complexity of the sale, the length of the sales cycle, etc. Typically, and again, this is more in a business-to-business software environment, it's typical that you forecast quarterly. And so one thing that I think is really important is that the salespeople, sales management, et cetera, they all forecast, their business. So, and sometimes that takes a little while. You need, again, metrics is something to really help you do that. But after a while, you can, based on all of the opportunities you're managing, depending on what the stage, then you can come up with a forecast. And over time, the more numbers you have, the more accurate those forecasts become. But typically those forecasts, they're more accurate when they're done quarterly. Monthly ones are a little tough, and it's partly just because there's a lot of bleed over from month to month, and quarter to quarter is kind of a more natural way to do that. Now, obviously, if you have a consumer-based product, like in retail, you might forecast daily. So it definitely is a little different depending on the nature of your solution. But certainly I would, recommend you forecast at least quarterly. And then that's a way you can compare that forecast against plan, and you can understand, hey, is there a gap there? Is there something we need to do to invest more in marketing to drive more leads, or something we need to do to increase our conversion ratios or whatever. Quotas should be reviewed. I recommend you review and update them annually. So you don't really want to be changing somebody's quota like every quarter. But it does make sense to review them update them annually, and that might change based on kind of the growth trajectory of the business, or you may add additional salespeople. You might be splitting up territories. So there's a lot of different reasons, as you kind of go through a strategic planning process why you might want to adjust your quotas. But typically, it's better to do that annually, and typically it's probably better to do it based on your fiscal year. Although some companies I've worked for have a different compensation year than their fiscal year, which both of which can be different than the calendar year. But that can also add a little bit of confusion. One thing I'd really recommend is you be careful of terminology. And I've seen this even at SAP, again, pretty sophisticated company, where we ran into problems where someone was talking revenues and the other guy was talking annual contract value, which are two different things, or certainly can be. And so it's just really important that you speak the same language, and to define what those things are, because ARR and ACV are not necessarily the same. Revenues is not necessarily the same. Bookings is not necessarily the same. So just make sure that and again, those are all fine if you choose whichever one you choose, and you may use multiple ones as kind of metrics, but you just need to make sure everybody's on the same page when you're talking those types of numbers. And the other thing that I always kind of remind people is that as you're looking to build a sales team, closing deals is sometimes not the biggest challenge. Oftentimes it's building pipeline. So keep that in mind. It may be that you need some additional work around marketing to help kind of build the awareness in order to build pipeline that can then turn into opportunities that your salespeople can sell. So it's not all just about closing deals. It's really building pipeline. I think is probably the biggest challenge for most startups that I see that are in a position that they're looking to scale. It's not so much closing deals as it is building pipeline. And as I mentioned earlier, I think case studies and referenceable customers should be a sales objective. It's something that kind of makes sure that during the sales process and after the sales process, that they're maintaining a customer-centric viewpoint, and I think it's really critical. So it may not be like you're putting a quota based on that, but you may put an expectation of, hey, I expect you to be able to deliver 10% of your customers should be a case study, or whatever. Come up with a number, and at least make that an objective. And then the other thing is make sure you're sharing best practices across the team. So if you have one guy who's kind of hitting it out of the park, you need to understand, what's he doing right, and then maybe it's the way he's kind of communicating with a specific persona, or the way he's overcoming a specific objection or whatever. But it's really critical to make sure that you do as much as you can to share best practices across the team. And that's about all I had. So I think we're at about 50 minutes or so, maybe a little more. So I think I'll open it up now to Q&A.
Okay. All right, Peter, I'm going to throw some questions at you here.
Right.
So if anyone has questions, please add them to the Q&A box. You can see the Q&A option kind of on the bottom Zoom bar. So there's a few questions related to compensation. One of them, I think, it's basically asking if you can put any numbers around compensation. If there's a typical range of salary, like, it can depend on the industry, of course, but typical range. And then I guess, in addition to the typical range, if there's another way for, say, a startup that maybe is not the most cash heavy organization.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it is a little hard to say. I can tell you that, I know a lot of like fairly well-established software companies in Vancouver would kind of have an inside sales guy. And again, obviously with COVID, things have kind of changed, and everybody's kind of an inside sales guy now, but it's more, I'd say, more of a junior sales guy doing telephone sales. They were making around $75,000 to $100,000. And now Vancouver is probably a little more expensive than some other cities. And field sales guys were making 300K plus, and these are, again, people you might have in in remote locations, kind of, hitting kind of enterprise type customers. Now that again is a, these are enterprise software deals, and with fairly successful, companies, but it gives you an idea if you're trying to compete for that type of person, what you might, be looking to do. So, and I can give you an idea, like I say, I have two sons, both of which who started in sales roles in the last 2 years, in Montreal. They both started around $75,000 to $100,000 a bit, and that's based on target earnings. So that's assuming they hit their quota at 100%. So I think that's fairly common.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If I missed, it was a bit of a long question, so
Sure.
whoever asked that,
Okay.
if we missed anything, feel free to ask a
Okay.
follow-up. Otherwise, do you have any resources for salesperson contracts or compensation models?
Well, I have kind of I'd have to see if it's something that's kind of easily consumable. I had put together a kind of a spreadsheet that shows a little bit how compensation models work. I can see if it's something I can share, Angie. I don't know how consumable it is without like a fairly deep explanation. I think I actually had a Word doc as well that accompanied it. That it was more for a company I worked for that was looking to implement one. But as yeah, it's probably a little hard to get into it right now, because it requires a bunch of numbers. But let me see if I can actually put that together, and maybe we can upload that somewhere, and make that available to folks.
Okay, sounds good. How often should bonus payments be to salespeople? Is it annual or otherwise?
Yeah, well, that varies quite a bit. So there's kind of two different main types of variable compensation. One which I would call more bonus, which might be more based on total company performance or something, and one which is more commission, which is based on their personal kind of sales effort. If it's bonus, more kind of something that's based on total company performance, is typically annual. And if it's really a commission, I'd say the most common model is, well, there's two. It's either that it's paid monthly, and it's usually you actually pay the commissions around 30 to 45 days after the close of the month. So if you did a deal, for instance, in March, and on March 31st you close a deal, you would actually get paid the commission on that deal on May 15th. That's probably the most common model. The other one is that and it might be 30 days. It kind of depends a little bit on accounting and some other factors. The other one is it's quarterly. I can tell you that at SAP it was a quarterly model. So all of your commissions from January through March would be paid on May 15th. So so that's a fairly common model.
Okay. And then kind of related to compensation, Amanda's kind of asking, I guess, why is it important to have performance-based compensation for sales, I guess, relative to, say, your standard person who doesn't earn bonuses for the same amount of hours worked? So I guess it's a
Well,
question.
Again, so personally, I think performance-based or some kind of performance-based or incentive-based compensation makes sense for every role, not necessarily just based on a personal thing, because sometimes it's a lot harder to measure. If you have a development team, what one person's contribution to something is. But I do think it does make sense. The reason why I say pay a salesperson higher is the salespeople are kind of a little bit more risk reward. First of all, you're paying them more usually. So it's a little more risk reward kind of job. And if they don't make their plan, they're costing. So if you, again, I'll give you an example of a guy at SAP who might have been a field sales guy who made $300,000 a year. But he got paid 60% commission, meaning his salary was only about $140,000 a year. If he doesn't sell anything, he's making less than half of his salary. You're not going to do that to a developer, right? Say like, hey, if you don't, whatever, develop this widget, we're going to pay half, right? So it's kind of a little more understood in sales, but it is also, you want them to, if possible, overperform, right? That they're the one who are, it's kind of the machine, the engine that's driving the revenue of the organization, which helps fund, all of your other efforts. So as much as possible, you want to give them a specific quota, and you want to give them incentive to make sure that they hit that quota. And sales is not an easy job, which is typically why it's a higher paid job. And if possible, you want to even incent them to overperform. And like I say, a lot of companies out there, they will give a guy a quota and say, if you make a certain, if you hit a certain number, then you're going to hit 100% of this value. Over that, we're going to pay you an accelerator, meaning you're going to actually be incented to do even more.
Okay, and related to that, David's asking if a salesperson doesn't bring in results or do their quota, how long do you keep them for? How long do you keep paying them the base salary?
Yeah, well, it depends a little bit about kind of what your typical sales cycle is and stuff like that. So I mean, if you have a 3-month sales cycle, and you're going to train the guy for a month, then you wouldn't really almost expect him to sell a deal for 4 months. But if you have a faster sales cycle, it would be faster. So again, it depends a little bit on what is the the nature of your solution. But it could be anywhere from a month to 6 months, I would say. That you could, and if he's not delivering necessary sales, especially in those early months, is he doing the activities? So this is again why it's important to have other objectives which are very clearly laid out. Is he doing the activities that are going to lead to sales, which might be cold calls or might be doing demos and some of those other things. So you can't always just measure, at least early on just sales and revenue, but you can also kind of look at is he doing all of those things that are going to lead to sales and revenue? And then, like I say, this is again one reason why you typically pay a salesperson a fairly high variable amount, is that they kind of cost you less if they underperform.
Okay. And one last question we'll squeeze in here from Iraj, which is, what platforms are good to look at for a SaaS sales agent?
I'm assuming they're talking about recruiting platforms. So, I mean, I would say LinkedIn Jobs is probably, a good one. I think also, I mean, some of the basic ones like Indeed and stuff like that, I think are okay. The other thing is you can look at, there's some kind of other ones like, there's one, geez, I can't remember what it's called now. It's just, that it's more, Angel List, which is essentially more around, it's really a kind of a startup forum, but a lot of people also post jobs there as well, and it's actually not it's a good place to find people who really have an entrepreneurial mindset and are looking for a growth company. So that's actually not a bad place. I've actually had people post jobs on Craigslist and find people there. So, but I would say, LinkedIn, if you're looking for professional salespeople, that's probably the first place I would start. By the way, the other place, again, if you're looking for somebody maybe more freshly out of university, especially if they have kind of specific technical capabilities, like you're looking for somebody with an electrical engineering background or something, the university job boards are also very good. So like all of the universities, SFU, UBC, BCIT, have career management centers. It's typically free to advertise on them. So again, I'm probably not as good for sales, but again, you might find commerce students that are interested in getting into sales, or people with more technical capabilities that you might be looking for in a technical sales situation. That might be like a place to look.
Okay, yeah, good idea. All right, I think that's it for questions, which is good because we're out of time. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to Peter for the seminar on hiring and sales. And we are recording, so we'll put this and the slides up tomorrow. And that's a bit of a wrap on the first round of our Sales Acceleration Program and Education Series. So thank you to Peter and to Rochelle and to everyone who's attended along the way. So appreciate your time, and we'll be announcing details on the next round of Sales Acceleration and the return of some of these topics pretty soon. So so stay tuned on that. Yeah. So have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again.
Okay, great. Thanks, Angie.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay.
Take
See you,
care.
everybody. Thanks a
Thanks
lot.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Bye, everyone. Thanks, everyone.